session, effective branching strategies for Salesforce developers. So, by means of introduction, as is traditional, I am Cowell. I'm one of the DevOps advocates over at ESEC. But before that, I spent 12 years as a Salesforce developer and architect for various users, both end users, consulting, and everything in between. So I've done a lot of deployments in my time, and hopefully I can share some of that experience with you. So since version control is kind of at the fundamental building blocks of branching strategies, I'm going to touch upon that a little bit. What we want to cover today is finding a branching strategy that fits your needs as a business, the way that you work, rather than saying, this is the best practice, you definitely have to do this. So by selecting the right branching strategy, you're effectively setting yourself up for success in a few ways. So it's going to help you define how each of those changes is handled by your team, and that they will follow a common approach to change management. Hopefully, it'll help reduce the complexity of that change control in your deployments, so that when changes move from environment to environment, whether that's a bug fix, whether it's UAT as part of a sprint, or release to a prod, things become a lot simpler and easier because everybody's kind of working the same approach. But it also contributes to the efficiency and the accuracy of your process, because you're getting that team collaboration within your team, but also with other teams as well. So the branching strategy that we select there, it's going to shape and is shaped by the factors such as your team size, the team's technical ability, like whether they're familiar with Git and with source control, how often you want to release, what your release cadence is. So there's a lot of factors that will kind of determine which strategy that you want to select there. So it's important that you select a model that kind of takes all of that into consideration. So I'm going to show you some of the common approaches that we've seen across teams of all sizes, and hopefully one of those will kind of resonate with you for your team or your clients, and you'll be able to kind of take that back and implement it, or a variation. So to set the scene, what I'm going to do is give you a quick reminder of what version control is all about. And hopefully some of you kind of attended the previous session on Git that Oz gave. I gave an introduction to that. But generally, version control is not a new concept. So some of you will have heard of it before. And it's kind of underpinned software development on a lot of platforms, not just Salesforce, for quite some time. And until recently, Salesforce has kind of been a bit behind the curve on source control, version control, DevOps in general, although we're seeing them making some good insight into that now. And that's mostly because Salesforce's kind of mantra of clicks, not code. So it's very declarative, very point and click, which makes it very easy and powerful to deliver those changes without the need for that complex dev tools. But because of that, as a side effect, a lot of the tools that are used by developers on other platforms haven't always been adopted as quickly in the Salesforce space. So the ecosystem has kind of, as always, taken its own approach and kind of managed it in its own unique way. But over the past few years, we've seen Salesforce mature into this space, and with that complex functionality, needs a little more complexity around the delivery aspects of things. So we did a survey of around 500 Salesforce teams, and we found that 70% of them are now using version control in some form or another, which is a fundamentally fantastic improvement. Now, version control, as we may have seen from sort of other sessions, it's a means of tracking changes to files over time. Okay, and the key there is files. So those files can be text documents, they can be source code, or most importantly, they can be Salesforce metadata. So what that gives you is a complete history of any changes to any file at any time by anyone. And that gives you a much greater insight into the changes that are going through your org, the work that's being done, the origin of what was changed by whom and when. And that allows you to plan more efficiently, allows you to deliver more efficiently. And so there's huge advantages to working this way. Now, the de facto standard for source control seems to be Git. Everyone, I would say not everyone, but the majority of folks have standardise on that as a platform. And that's why you'll see a lot of the tooling and a lot of the strategies centred around the use of Git. So, when you're picking your strategy, you need to consider a few things. What is the size of your team? Okay, so the larger the team, potentially the more folks that are going to be making changes to your Salesforce org, and therefore the chance of complexity creeping in increases there. And with that complexity, you've got to look at the complexity of your team. You know, is there newer, less experienced members of the team? Do you have more admins than developers? Do you have an architect? If so, you're very lucky. But also, you know, it's around their comfort level with working in this way. So you have to kind of bake that into, okay, let's potentially start off with something a little more simplified and build up to the more complex strategies. We talked about the release cadence. So the choice of strategy sometimes helps determine how quickly you're able to release, how many review processes and stages and checks and balances you have in that process. But I think also one of the most important things to consider is, what is your current workflow? You know, in many ways, switching to using version control is a great opportunity to re-evaluate that workflow and see if it is still fit for purpose. It may have been when you first started your process, but as things evolve and as the platform itself evolves, that may no longer still be true. So, this strategy, using Git as a backup, is often the first step that teams take when they are looking to sort of bring version control into their metadata. They set up one branch per each of those environments and start pushing that metadata from the org into those Git branches. Sometimes with an automated CI job, but generally not. If they're at this early stage of using version control, they generally haven't got to the automation stage. Now, while this is a decent way to get started with getting your metadata in Git, it's not really source-driven development. So source control is not really acting as the source of truth here. It's just a record of changes that have happened. It's kind of after the fact. So it's still useful. You get more benefits though if you kind of change the flow, change the workflow so that actually Git is where your change starts to flow, not where it ends up at the end of that process. So in this example, you can see it doesn't really support multiple teams working in parallel on development. It doesn't support regularly deploying from that source control to Salesforce. This is much more Salesforce into Git. Like I said, it's more of a backup mechanism. Now next on from that, we have the feature branch model. And this is probably one of the more common and straightforward things. And this is certainly one that we recommend as a starting point with getting into source control. So with the feature branch strategy, the latest version of your metadata is stored on your master or main branch. And then you effectively take a copy of that for every feature that you want to work on. You work on that, you do your development, you commit to that, and then when that piece is ready, you can then merge it back into the main branch and it kind of becomes that source of truth again. So what usually happens in a lot of these scenarios is that we apply some automation so that when the main branch is updated, that kicks off the jobs that deploy it into your orgs, whether that's your UAT, your production, or whatever. And optionally, you can have those stage gates to say, okay, I don't want to deploy to production automatically. I want to make sure that it deploys to UAT automatically, do my testing, and then when I say yes, this is complete, then we can kick it up to the next level. So this is what we call the protected master branch, and the reason for that is that those stage gates that I talked about around testing, around making sure that everything is fit for purpose, are introduced kind of at the strategy level. So it's very similar to the feature branch, but it does provide this long-lived integration branch. Okay? So that's where your feature branches that we talked about a moment ago would get merged back into that. You do all your testing, your QA, you get business sign-off, whatever your processes are. When that is marked as this is production ready, then you would trigger that process. So the drawback of this model is that it's not possible to propagate just a small subset of your changes. So for example, I've seen it in a lot of scenarios, particularly with financial services, where they will say, okay, in this release, we've changed our mind about this JIRA story, that JIRA story, can you take it out of the release? It's possible, but it's much more difficult when you've got that one single integration branch. So for that reason, we introduce what we call the expanded branching model. And I know that a lot of teams will use this approach. So this model adds a few extra long-lived branches which correspond to your Salesforce tools, your integration, your UAT, your QA environment. So once a feature branch is complete, so a single ticket, a single JIRA story that maps to your branch, rather than merge it into the master, you merge it into your integration branch, and then as you want to promote each of those things individually, you can say, okay, this story or feature branch is going into QA. When it's been QA'd, okay, it's now going into user testing, and so you can actually have that level of granularity around which stories make it into each of the environments. And it allows you to do things like, if a manager comes to you and says, what's happening with JIRA 1, 2, 3, 4? Where are we at? You can say, okay, that one's in QA, that one's in UAT, this one's ready for production. So if you're in an environment where you're working with project managers that come and ask you multiple times a day on progress, you can actually answer their questions. It helps keep them quiet. So let's have a quick recap of some of those approaches. So first, we looked at Git as a backup, which is absolutely the easiest way to start with Git. And you do gain a backup of sorts, although please speak to the proper backup providers amongst our sponsors today, who will tell you why that's not the best backup solution. But it's not really source-driven development. You don't get that kind of workflow benefit from it. So next we have the feature branch model, which slowly starts to introduce some of those DevOps concepts around branching, around getting peer review of your changes, around working with Git in parallel with other developers. And so in that scenario, that's the first point at which your version control becomes your source of truth. But the problem with that is that your pipeline can get blocked by changes that are kind of behind it. So for example, if you're working on feature B, but feature A hasn't been fully tested yet, you can't get your work signed off until everything kind of cascades up that pipeline. The same sort of applies with the protected master branch. What that does bring to the equation, though, is the ability to have more robust test processes, more review, more testing, and it doesn't actually make it to your main or master branch prematurely before it's actually been signed off and reviewed. And then finally, we talked about the expanded branch model, which kind of brings elements of all of the others together. And what that does is it makes each feature branch much more discrete, and then each environment has its own branch, so that you can have that separation between what piece of work or what unit of work is where, anywhere in that process. And it removes that dependency because each ticket can move through at its own pace. Now I appreciate from a development perspective, it might be that there are direct dependencies outside of the deployment process. So for example, you might want to work on a flow, or deploy a flow, but you've got to wait until a certain set of objects and fields are deployed, for example, and that could be on a different ticket. But it certainly makes it a lot easier, and I would say the key to unlocking those type of scenarios is collaboration. Okay? Don't rely on the tools and the technology, rely on the team. So I appreciate that's been a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of our branching strategies. I have governor limits on my time today. So if you want to learn a little bit more about it at your own pace and kind of allow yourself as much time as you have available, I can recommend DevOps Launchpad, which is our free learning training site for all things DevOps. It works very similar to Trailhead. There are modules, there are units, there are quizzes, you get to it. We've launched a new certification track on that now. If you really want to sort of dive deep into that. Git branching strategies, which we've just covered, is one of the modules in there, and it goes into a lot more depth than I can do today. So yes, I would encourage folks to go and have a look at that. There's no commitment, there's no product tie-ins. I mean, my employer does make it, but it's not mandatory to buy our solution in order to get the value out of the learning there. So hopefully, that's given you a bit of inspiration on some of those strategies. Hopefully, shown you a branching model that might work for your organisation or for your customers, that you can implement as you start adopting Salesforce DevOps. For some of you that are more advanced, and I know there are some in the room, hopefully it's validated the approach that you're already using. But either way, hopefully you've got something out of that. I am just about good to go. Any questions for anyone?
Yeah, just one question. So sometimes it appears then, let's say, some bug appear on production, and this is only reproducible on production, right? Then we are making some hotfix, if this is like really urgent. So how then it will fit, let's say, to expanded branching strategy? Because let's say the regular approach is to create a sandbox, which is a replica of production, then you're making a fix there, then you deploy to production. But then it means that we need to replicate this change for any developer orgs, because this was a hotfix, so it should be anyway in the code base. So with these different branches, like, then how you will approach in this case?
Okay, so for the benefit of the recording, I'll quickly restate the question. Hotfix changes made into production, how do we propagate those backwards so that everybody gets them in their development environment? So absolutely, there is a branching strategy that will accommodate that. We haven't covered it today. However, what we would do is exactly that. We would have a hotfix branch that is used for that and is tied to the production environment. And then we would do one of two things. We can either, as developers, periodically, as part of our working practice, pull from that branch to make sure that we include it into our own branches, our feature branches. Or equally, we can do automation, okay, which is effectively doing the same thing. And what we can do, we can set up jobs that will do a pull request. It will do, potentially do a diff between those environments, or pull from the hotfix branch. I mean, ideally, your hotfix branch should be feeding back into your main or master branch anyway. But between those two techniques, you can then deploy backwards down your chain. And we definitely, we have a pipelines tool. I'm not here to plug our product, but we do have a visual pipeline tool that does allow that back propagation of changes where you've had to make those direct emergency changes. So it is definitely possible. It's just not covered in my introductory set of branches there.
Could you give us some insights on branching strategies for unlock managed packages? I mean, just are they addressed in your?
They largely can be. So the question was, branching strategies for unlocked packages. And I will admit that the majority of my work is mostly sort of org level or Git level, and I'm not really looking at the packages piece. But from what I understand, there's kind of two approaches that you can take there. So you can absolutely adopt any of these strategies that we've looked at, but your output from that, rather than being a deployment to your orgs, is the creation of a package, because you've already created the set of metadata that you're interested in. Now when I say you're interested in, you could be interested in deploying it, or you could be interested in packaging it, okay? Whether that's an unlocked package for just org-to-org stuff, or whether that's the more sort of ISV app exchange focused packaging there, which is a whole other topic, and I'll be the first to admit I don't fully understand the app exchange way of packaging. But equally, I think the other thing to consider, there's another branching strategy which I encourage folks to go and research, called Git flow. And Git flow is very much more designed around fixed, versionable, incremental software releases. So if you think about the traditional non-cloud software release, okay, we've just released version 2.5 of our software, please upgrade from version 2.4. To an extent, that's what packaging allows you to give. It's a bundle of known components that you can then bring to your orgs. And so Git flow as a branching strategy, which I haven't really covered here today, because there's so many branching strategies, that would be the one that probably closest aligns to it. that model. Anybody else? Gentleman at the front.
Yeah, hello. So we are currently using the expanding branching strategy, model strategy in our company. And we are struggling with one thing. So we have only staging and master branches, according to the sandbox it's linked to. And we've got one problem, which is that naturally, I don't know how it happens, but we have conflict between the staging and the master branch, and it comes regularly after some developments. So did you have to deal with that?
Yeah, so the question was around sort of merge conflicts between those different branches where they actually start getting out of sync with each other. So there's a few ways that can happen. So one is potentially your branches are too long-lived. Okay, so the pace of change means that it's so long since I've refreshed this branch or merged it back in, that actually a lot has changed in that time. If you're a very active team, that can happen. Equally, the interesting thing about this is that there are many ways to get changes into Git. Okay? So you theoretically could have a developer or an admin or whoever pushing stuff into those environments directly and not following the process. Okay? I'm not suggesting that folks are going rogue in your team, but it's a possibility that from a technical standpoint, that's how it can happen. So I think the biggest takeaway I would suggest for that is probably start looking at breaking work up into smaller chunks and push it in early and often. Okay? Because that gives the branches less opportunity to drift apart. Anybody else? Okay, we have 3 minutes remaining. Going to my team at the back. If questions occur to you throughout the course of the day, I'm kicking around. It's easy to find me. I'm heavily invested in DevOps. So do come and find me. I'll be happy to either try and answer your question or steer you in the direction of where to find the answers. And with that, thank you very much, everybody.